I'm going to structure this in 3 parts by the dates that are in your program: descent and initiation experiences. Religion was minimal in my Iowa upbringing. My family's weekly outings to attend the local Presbyterian church were mainly linked, in my mind, with me and my 2 younger sisters getting to wear our Sunday best outfits with little matching shoes and purses. Sunday school was a social event, a place where other kids hung out. And we heard Bible stories. Friends seemed to have more interesting religions, like my best girlfriend in 4th grade. I went with her to Catholic Mass, and they dipped their fingers in holy water, they chanted in Latin, they genuflected, they knelt at the altar and drank real red wine. A Jewish boyfriend in junior high school took me to visit his temple, and it also seemed more exotic than my own Protestant experience. I guess I'll take my glasses off and sacrifice seeing you for seeing my paper. In high school, we moved to a small college town not far from the University of Iowa. Under that refreshing influence, I committed my first act of individual protest. I went across the street from the Presbyterian church of my parents to join the more liberal Methodist church. I had also one good high school teacher who encouraged my literary inclinations, and I remember painstakingly making my way through every issue, every month, of my subscription to Harper's Magazine, reading articles by such luminaries as Jean-Paul Sartre, for whom I was utterly unprepared but fascinated. My academic aspirations were high, and I was accepted into the liberal arts college of my choice, but unfortunately, my parents couldn't see the value of spending so much money for something as ephemeral as education for a girl, and I was given my choice of colleges from the state schools. As a freshman at the University of Iowa in the fall of 1965, I found myself speechless in honors seminars where upper-class students discussed highbrow ideas like the death of God under the tutelage of erudite international professors who spoke the language of the intellect. They even had us read the entire Old Testament under the rubric of ancient literature. I pledged a sorority which deactivated me at the end of my freshman year when, like 4 other members of my pledge class, I got pregnant and had to get married to a senior on the cheerleading squad who was in ROTC. We lived in married student housing, Quonset huts on campus, until he graduated, and then we were assigned to Pease Air Force Base in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. At 19, I had my first baby in the teaching hospital in Iowa City, under the direction of an enthusiastic male resident who called having my choice of anesthetic natural childbirth. The marriage brought on my first real existential crisis, as I came to understand within the first year that I had made a horrible mistake in choosing someone who was supposed to be my partner for life, but whom I didn't actually know or love. When I arrived at the SAC base, I was presented with a small hardbound pamphlet entitled Mrs. Lieutenant, which purported to teach me the values under which I would need to conduct myself as an officer's wife. I experienced my first primitive awareness of being karmically trapped by my own choices in life. There seemed to be no way out of my situation. I could leave my husband, but without any marketable skills, and it was 1978, by then I had 2 small babies. What would I do, and where would I go? Back home to my father's house seemed a terrible alternative, so I toughed it out, promising myself that when a door opened for me, I would go through it. I entertained myself studying the Sunday New York Times and reading all the bestsellers on its weekly list. The base library kept a standing order for me and just sent the books over as they came in. I sewed intricate little outfits for my small daughters, utilized the base daycare center while I studied Old English at the University of New Hampshire nearby. And when my husband was sent to Vietnam in 1969, he actually built golf courses for the officers, I went home to Iowa, where I witnessed for the first time with a shock my father's alcoholism and my parents' hopeless marriage. I sought out my old friend, the Methodist minister, for help and tried to intervene, but without success. I share all of this in order to try to establish a palpable sense of the intellectual flatness and emotional bewilderment I was wrapped in at this particular moment. Very confusing, right before my first taste of spiritual liberation. I wanted to somehow conjure up what it was like to be so split in my consciousness at a time when the whole society was splitting wide open. In 1969, at my parents' home in Iowa, my mother and I watched Seymour Hersh on the Dick Cavett morning show as he unveiled the horrors of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam. While my mother insisted that they couldn't have done that, Vicki, and if they did, they must have had a good reason, the revelation haunted me and changed me forever. At the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, our next plum assignment, in the early spring of 1971, I got Kate Millett's Sexual Politics from the library. Reading it was an epiphany. Everything I had ever felt or thought seemed to rearrange itself within the framework of this brilliant intellectual container that she had provided. And for the first time, I truly knew myself. I had found my own authority. Just having the book on my coffee table was an act of rebellion, and I began to thrive. I tried briefly to get my husband to make a marriage contract, something I read about from another feminist writer. And then giving up on that, I wrote a letter to the local newspaper in Colorado Springs asking if there were any women's liberation groups happening. I need water. When some professors' wives from a local college answered my letter, I went to my first consciousness-raising group. They actually told me years later that I came in a T-shirt with happy faces on it. I don't remember that, but I believe it. Within 3 months, however, I had come out as a lesbian and filed for divorce. And within a year, I was back in college on a full scholarship where I would soon create the first interdisciplinary women's studies major at Colorado College. There is one day I recall that most vividly sums up the tremendously liberating force of feminism in my life. It was the morning after Halloween. This is kind of an anniversary. And I had stayed out all night at a women's liberation function where I had had my first sexual experience with a woman. I was driving home at dawn to what I assumed would be a frightening showdown with my husband. Instead of feeling fear, however, I felt unusually expanded, what I now understand to be an altered state. And what I noticed that morning as I drove was the sparkling, almost glittering clarity of the sunlight against the blue sky and the rays of light falling on beautiful Pikes Peak overlooking Colorado Springs. It was my first direct religious experience, and I knew I was free. The 5 years I spent in Colorado Springs as a single mother and women's liberation activist were very juicy. My daughters went to a community school where feminist friends were the teachers, and my life was caught up in direct action and public speaking. When I visited a women's circle at UC Irvine in Southern California, where they were learning to look at their own bodies with speculums and cure their own yeast infections with yogurt, I brought home a dozen plastic speculums and introduced the self-help concept to my women's group. From then on, we were a women's health organization. With a religious fervor, I joined marches, wrote mission statements, even co-wrote a women's self-help handbook called Circle One, widely used at the time by feminist clinics around the country. And I spoke on conference panels for the reproductive rights of women everywhere. When in 1973 the Supreme Court made abortion legal, we opened our own feminist GYN clinic in Colorado Springs that continued for 10 years, even after I left. I got Lonnie Barback to come from Berkeley and train us in pre-orgasmic counseling groups, which became my specialty. I had male and female lovers as I wished, sometimes at the same time, and it seemed that we had broken the mold. Part 2. The shadow inside of all this freedom was my health. I think of those times and I see myself speaking on women's health panels with a cigarette hanging out of my mouth. My diet was mostly chocolate, and I almost never slept. Chronic tension headaches required me to ingest larger and more potent prescription pills over the years to subdue the pain. And by 1976, when I left Colorado Springs for Berkeley with my partner, Karen Vogel, and my prepubescent daughters, I was terribly ill and I couldn't figure out why. Once again, my inner conflict built to a breaking point, and I not only threw my prescription drugs down the toilet, but all of Western medicine as well. I've written elsewhere of my shamanic healing crisis and the healing that came spontaneously to me in those times through dreams, visions, herbal medicine, nutritious food, the practice of yoga, which has remained with me as a lifelong path. In the first psychic reading I ever had, a clairvoyant told me that when I got feminism, I thought it was the whole thing, but that in fact I had barely cracked the door, and it was now opening into dimensions I had never known possible. I had direct experiences of reincarnation. I dreamed what would happen in advance of events, and once I even wrote a check out for groceries before the clerk had told me the total. I got the heat that heals in my hands and catalyzed spontaneous recoveries for myself, my family, and other people. One spectacular visionary experience plunged me into a sustained state of bliss while crystal clear images flashed on the wall as if they were projected on a screen of Amazons, goddesses, gorgons, griffins, and words that appeared first in a strange, unrecognizable script and then dissolved into English so that I could read them. Heal, Helena. I don't know if you've seen the Mother Peace cards, but they are multicultural and they broke the mold. They're really a tool for women's subjectivity practice and deity yoga and a lot of different things. They've developed an almost devotional following of women around the world, sold 200,000 decks by now. We became part of an emerging goddess community in the Bay Area that was very creative and alive, practicing our private devotion to the Mother Goddess and performing public rituals and ceremonies in women's spirituality. As a legal minister in California, I also perform marriages and funerals and so on. After Karen and I split up in 1981, I married Jonathan Tenney for 8 years, an astrologer, and the father of my 17-year-old son, Aaron Eagle, who has Down syndrome and who was the subject of my 1994 book, Down is Up for Aaron Eagle. I ran a popular school for women in shamanistic healing in Oakland during the late 1980s and published a magazine called Snake Power, a journal of contemporary female shamanism. And in 1991, I wrote my handbook for women healers called Shakti Woman, Feeling Our Fire, Healing Our World, the New Female Shamanism. For almost a decade, I traveled internationally, teaching and speaking to women about Mother Peace and about healing and the dark goddess and the shamanistic energies that I believe to be natural to our biology. I still lead groups of women on tours to ancient sacred sites occasionally, where we perform rituals and revision an ancient way of life that was peaceful and matristic. Although we certainly would never have used the word ourselves, the term ourselves, I am part of the group of independent feminist scholars that those in the academy have called essentialist, which I think is, after listening to people in this conference, is sort of an essentializing gesture to make us that when we wouldn't call ourselves that. But it is due to our belief in a particular value and a particular way of life that emerges organically from being female. Instead of throwing biology out, we're trying to take it back. And instead of being defined by sex, we're trying to reclaim sexuality. In my original research, I show how this lunar, female-centered approach is typical of ancient worldwide shamanism, which was originally female. And my forthcoming book, The Double Goddess, Women Sharing Power, frames this concept under the rubric of female sovereignty, even including the governing of society. I've taught as an adjunct professor in 2 master's degree programs in women's spirituality since the beginning in CIIS, California Institute of Integral Studies, and New College in San Francisco. I'm here with Eleanor Gaden, by the way, this weekend, who's really the foremother, the founder of those programs. When not teaching, researching, writing books, or traveling, I've made my living for more than 20 years by seeing private clients in Mother Peace astrology, shamanistic healing, body work, and the study and practice of tantric sexuality. Since 1980, I've also been a practicing Tibetan Buddhist, and this is part 3, using chanting and visualization and other magical practices to transform my life and my health. For almost 20 years, I was in and out of Buddhist institutions, Tibetan Buddhist institutions, unable to find a home, a sangha, a community, due to the pervasive and largely unconscious male domination of most centers that were established in the West. Not only the male lamas have been biased against women, but the white men who until recently ran most of the centers that were established here were intentionally barring the door to women being anything other than secret consorts or helping in the kitchen. Nowadays, this trend seems happily to be reversing, as most centers are now run by women, and younger Tibetan lamas are more open to the presence of equally gifted female practitioners and teachers. Biographies of famous yoginis have been translated into English, like that of Yeshe Sogyal, the female founder of Tibetan Buddhism, who hid the terma, or mind treasures, for people like me and Karen to discover in later reincarnations, as we did with Mother Peace. In 1997, I had what in shamanistic language would be called a big dream. I dreamed that a volcano erupted on the top of my head, leaving a dime-sized hole, out of which a stupa, a Tibetan Buddhist stupa, emerged, made of wedding cake frosting. In Tibetan Buddhism, such a protuberance from the top of one's head is called an usnisa and points to a state of enlightened wisdom. In the vivid and powerful dream, I was leaving a large building where I'd been teaching my students. I was wishing that they would join me, but accepting that they were busy with their own agendas. And I was doing this in order to stand in line with my son, Aaron Eagle, waiting to speak to a lama. I particularly noted how nice it was to be with Aaron, who lacks the self-conscious aggressiveness of most of our egos, and is therefore more spacious to be with than most people. When I finally got to talk to the Lama, he ignored me completely on account of my being a woman. But I leaned over and pointed to my stupa, at which point he snapped into action. It seemed, at least in the dream, that certain protocols in Tibetan Buddhism would naturally overrule more limited personal prejudices. Later, in that same year, 1997, I was invited to travel in Russia to visit museums and speak with archaeologists who've been unearthing Amazon graves near the Volga River for the last 50 years. I noticed that many of the priestesses, the Russians call them priestesses, were buried with a bent knee, also typical of the Tibetan Buddhist icon of the Dakini, or skywalking woman. Pursuing this very intuitive connection, which seemed a long shot at best, has filled the better part of my last 5 years of scholarly endeavor, while my public career went through a nasty crash and burn phase as a result of changing fashions in the culture. Just as the publishing industry was going very bland, and my editor at Random House told me point blank to take the goddess and the kundalini out of my work and she might be able to sell it, I decided instead to act on my deeper longings to be more quiet and live in the country. In desperation, I pulled the plug on my active community involvement in the Bay Area, and I moved to the mountains near Santa Cruz. There, I do mostly private teaching and counseling, and I adapt Tibetan Buddhist Dakini practices for my women students and clients. The Dakinis are icons of untamed female freedom, unlike anything we have in the West. And the mandala practice is a method for transforming your life by putting yourself as the subject inside of your own reality instead of the object of someone else's reality. Okay, I can almost make this in 1 minute. When I got to my cabin in the woods, it was as if I was shipwrecked and thrown up on some foreign shore. I had no money and seriously needed healing. The fact that I couldn't sell a book or even get a magazine article published, was very discouraging, and I had to be vigilant in order not to sink into a debilitating despair. I realized that if my Buddhist practices were any good at all, then they should be able to help me through such a transition period. I began to do my Dakini practices in earnest for the first time daily and with intent. My forest cottage is heated by a wood stove and it gets below freezing, so I had to learn to chop wood and make a fire, all good training for a witch in the woods. I take daily walks in the hills and do my practices at waterfalls. I have glorious, uninterrupted periods of quiet in which I'm able to contemplate and experience direct connection with the forces of nature. In the middle of our current focus on war, fear, and global mayhem, I'm finding the peace and tranquility that I believe are necessary for any of us to change the ingrained patterns of aggression and hostility in ourselves internally, as well as in the world outside us. I have 2 new books coming out next year from a small press in Vermont, and they seem to love my Goddess and Kundalini. I'll skip the next part. Let's see. The last thing I want to say is that apropos of the dream I had with the stupa in my head is the fact that my magical house is 1 mile up the hill from Vajrayana school of Tibetan Buddhism called Pema Oso Ling. I can hear the lamas blowing their Tibetan horns when they do ceremonies. Aaron Eagle and I have started going there to practice, to participate in retreats where he goes to what he calls Buddha camp. And I learned complicated chanting and visualization practices to the black, wrathful Dakini Troma. Her name means angry woman. In the company of many Tibetan lamas, even a woman now and then, and serious Vajrayana practitioners with their bells and drums. Recently, I've made a fabulous connection with a young radical lama who is free from the constraints of doctrine. I think he's about 32. He sanctions and encourages my work with the Dakini practices that I've been adapting for my Western students who are mostly not Buddhist. And I'll stop there.